In the opulent yet perilous world of King Henry VIII's court, where ambition and betrayal danced beneath the flicker of torchlight and the weight of gilded tapestries, Anne Boleyn emerged as a force unlike any other. She was no docile maiden, no mere ornament to be admired and discarded. She was a tempest cloaked in silk, her laughter a melody that cut through the heavy air of intrigue, her presence a spark that ignited both fascination and fear. Born around 1501 into the ambitious Boleyn family, Anne was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a cunning diplomat whose aspirations stretched far beyond his modest noble roots in Norfolk. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, descended from one of England's oldest families, imbued Anne with a sense of lineage that fueled her confidence. From an early age, Anne was groomed for greatness, sent to the courts of Europe to refine her skills and broaden her horizons. In the Netherlands, under the tutelage of Archduchess Margaret of Austria, she learned the subtleties of courtly etiquette, mastering languages and the art of diplomacy. Later, in France, she served in the household of Queen Claude, absorbing the sophistication of the French court, where wit, charm, and intellectual prowess were as valued as beauty. When she returned to England in 1522, she was no ordinary young woman. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes held a smoldering intensity, her wit was as sharp as a rapier, and her confidence set her apart from the demure ladies of the English court. She moved through the halls of Greenwich and Whitehall with a grace that turned heads, her voice carrying a French lilt that marked her as exotic, her conversation a blend of erudition and allure that captivated men and women alike. To the courtiers, she was an enigma. To Henry VIII, she would become an obsession that would reshape a kingdom. England in the 1520s was a realm on the cusp of transformation, its king a charismatic yet volatile figure whose desires could shift the tides of history. Henry VIII, a Renaissance prince in his prime, was a man of contradictions, learned yet impulsive, devout yet defiant, charming yet ruthless. His court was a glittering stage, where power was both won and lost in the flicker of a glance or the weight of a whispered word. Anne's arrival coincided with the kingdom grappling with dynastic uncertainty. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess whose piety and dignity commanded respect, had produced no male heir, only a daughter, Mary. The Tudor dynasty, still young and fragile, hung on the promise of a son. It was into this fraught atmosphere that Anne stepped, her elegance and ambition a stark contrast to the traditional expectations of women. She first caught Henry's eye as the younger sister of his former mistress, Mary Boleyn, whose brief liaison with the king had been unremarkable, a fleeting dalliance that left no lasting mark. But Anne was no echo of her sister's compliance. She refused to be another royal conquest, a woman to be claimed and discarded in the shadows of the royal bedchamber. Instead, she offered something far more potent, the thrill of pursuit. When Henry's advances grew bold, Anne held firm, denying him her bed with a resolve that both frustrated and enthralled him. She understood the stakes with the clarity that belied her youth. To yield too soon would make her a mistress, destined to be cast aside like her sister. To hold out could make her a queen. Her refusal was not mere coyness, it was a calculated strategy gamble that leveraged Henry's passion against his pride. Letters poured from the king's hand 17 survive, preserved in the Vatican archives, each brimming with longing, frustration, and poetic admiration. "My heart and I surrender themselves into your hands," he wrote in one, his words, a testament to a passion that bordered on desperation. Anne, with masterful restraint, kept him at arm's length, responding with letters that teased and promised without ever surrendering. She wove a spell of allure, her every gesture, her sidelong glances, her knowing smiles deepening his obsession. Her French fashion, with its low necklines and elegant hoods, set her apart from the staid English styles, drawing eyes and whispers alike. She was a performer on a dangerous stage, and she played her role with precision, while nobles whispered their disdain and clergy fretted over her boldness. Anne rose with meteoric speed. She was not content to be merely the king's beloved, a fleeting object of desire. She became his confidant, his intellectual equal, gauging him in debates, that ranged from theology to statecraft. Her library was a treasure trove of reformist texts: Tyndale's English Bible, Luther's treatises smuggled from the continent and read in secret. She championed the cause of religious reform, advocating for an English Bible accessible to all, a radical notion in a Catholic-dominated realm. She distributed alms to the poor, patronized scholars, and corresponded with humanists like Erasmus, her mind shaped by the progressive ideals she had encountered in France. In Henry's presence, she was unafraid to challenge his decisions, to question his policies, to argue for the dissolution of corrupt monasteries. Her courage enthralled him, but it also sowed seeds of resentment among those who saw her as an upstart, a woman who dared to wield influence in a man's world. Her intelligence was a double-edged sword, captivating Henry while alienating the court's traditionalists. Anne Boleyn was not navigating the Tudor court, she was reshaping it, demanding a role that history had never intended for a woman. Her ambition was not merely to love a king, but to wear his crown and steer his kingdom. Yet power, especially for a woman in the Tudor era, was a perilous throne, balanced on the edge of a precipice. As Anne ascended, her radiance drew admiration, but also bred enemies as swiftly as she acquired the glittering jewels that adorned her neck and fingers. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, was a formidable adversary, a Spanish princess whose lineage traced back to the great Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Catherine's piety, her stoic dignity, and her refusal to yield her place earned her the loyalty of the court's conservative faction. Her supporters, many of them powerful nobles and devout Catholics, viewed Anne as a dangerous temptress, a usurper who threatened not only the sanctity of the monarchy, but the soul of England itself. They whispered of her French ways, her sharp tongue, her reformist sympathies, casting her as a heretic who had bewitched the king. The Pope's refusal to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine in 1531 only intensified the conflict. Anne, with her Protestant leanings and her bold defiance of Catholic orthodoxy, became a lightning rod for their ire. In a seismic act of rebellion, Henry broke from Rome in 1532, passing the Act of Supremacy to establish the Church of England with himself as its head. This schism was not merely a marital maneuver, it was a revolution that fractured Christendom, dissolved monasteries, and isolated England from its Catholic allies. The cost was staggering: diplomatic ties crumbled, trade suffered, and the kingdom teetered on the brink of rebellion, all for a woman who refused to be a mistress. On a stormy January day in 1533, Anne and Henry married in a clandestine ceremony at Whitehall Palace, their vows whispered in a candlelit chapel, the air thick with secrecy and defiance. By spring, Anne was pregnant, her coronation a spectacle of opulence that masked the unease rippling through the kingdom. On June 1, 1533, she was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey, her coronet gleaming atop her dark hair, her gown of crimson velvet trailing behind her like a river of blood. The ceremony was a triumph of Tudor propaganda, with pageants and feasts that proclaimed Anne as England's hope for a male heir. As she processed through London's streets, her litter adorned with cloth of gold, the crowds were divided. Some cheered, awed by her beauty and the promise of a new dynasty. Others jeered, their voices low but venomous, calling her the king's whore or the concubine. Anne smiled through it all, her chin high, her eyes defiant, her hand resting lightly on her swelling belly. She was queen now, carrying the promise of a son who would secure the Tudor line. Yet, even as she basked in her moment of glory, the seeds of tragedy were quietly sown. Behind the pageantry, those who bowed in her presence sharpened their knives. The crown that adorned her head was heavy with expectation, and as her belly swelled, so too did the tide of resentment that would one day drag her to the scaffold. The court, once a stage for flattery and feasts, had transformed into a battlefield of intrigue. Behind Anne's dazzling gowns, emerald silks embroidered with gold, sapphire velvets studded with pearls, and the opulence of royal banquets, where minstrels played lutes and goblets clinked with French wine, whispers cut sharper than daggers. Anne walked on glass, her every step scrutinized by a court that both feared and despised her. Many of Henry's advisers, particularly the staunchly Catholic faction led by men like Thomas More, loathed her for her role in England's break from Rome. They branded her a witch in elegant Latin, spinning tales that she had ensnared the king with dark arts. Rumors, born more of malice than evidence, claimed she bore a sixth finger on her left hand, or a disfiguring wen on her neck, marks of the devil that justified their hatred. These accusations, rooted in fear of her influence, laid the groundwork for her eventual downfall. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and once an ally in her reformist vision, began to turn. A master of political maneuvering, he had risen from humble origins to become the king's indispensable strategist, but his alliance with Anne frayed as their ambitions clashed. She challenged his seizure of monastic wealth, advocating for the funds to be redirected to charity and education rather than the royal coffers. She disputed his foreign policy, favoring alliances with Protestant states over Catholic ones. Her assertiveness, once a shared strength, became a threat to his power. Cromwell sensed the shifting winds and aligned his loyalty not with Anne, but with his own survival. Even among her ladies-in-waiting, women like Jane Parker, her brother's wife, or Margaret Shelton, there were those who curtsied by day, but whispered treason by night. The court was a nest of spies, every smile a potential mask for betrayal. Anne's household was a microcosm of the court's division. Some, like her chaplain Matthew Parker or her musician Mark Smeaton, admired her reformist zeal and her patronage of the arts. Others, resentful of her influence, fed gossip to her enemies. Her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was her fiercest defender, his charm and wit a mirror of her own. He was a poet, a diplomat, a courtier who shared Anne's love of music and reformist ideals. Together, they were a formidable pair, their banter a bright spot in the court's gloom. But George's loyalty made him a target, his closeness to Anne fodder for scandal. He warned her of the tightening web of intrigue, the courtiers who smiled to her face, but plotted in shadowed corners, men like the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, whose ambition outweighed his familial ties. Yet Anne, emboldened by her meteoric rise, believed her power unassailable. She had climbed too high too swiftly to fathom a fall. Her confidence, once her greatest asset, began to blind her to the dangers closing in. Henry's gaze, however, began to wander, drawn to the soft-spoken Jane Seymour, a pale, unassuming lady-in-waiting from a conservative Wiltshire family. He found in her everything Anne was not: meek, obedient, and untainted by scandal. Jane's demure demeanor, her lowered eyes and gentle voice, offered the promise of stability and, crucially, a male heir. Her family's Catholic sympathies aligned with the court's traditionalists, making her a safe choice in a kingdom fractured by religious upheaval. Henry, increasingly volatile and obsessed with securing his dynasty, began to see Anne not as his queen, but as an obstacle. His once ardent love cooled, replaced by impatience and suspicion. The court buzzed with feigned pleasantries, but treachery lurked in every bow. Spies fed rumors to Cromwell, resurrecting old accusations. Flirtations with musicians like Mark Smeaton, whose lute playing had once delighted Anne. Clandestine meetings with courtiers like Sir Henry Norris, the king's trusted confidant. Even whispers of plots against Henry's life. Truths were twisted into lies, and lies hardened into supposed truths. Anne's sharp tongue and unyielding spirit had made too many enemies. The birth of her daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, had been a triumph, but also a disappointment. Henry had expected a son, and the court's whispers grew louder with each passing year that no male heir arrived. The loss of a male child in a miscarriage in January 1536 turned those whispers into a roar. The woman who had appended a kingdom was now deemed expendable. In the spring of 1536, as flowers bloomed around the palaces of Hampton Court and Greenwich, Anne's doom blossomed alongside them. The betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was a storm orchestrated by those who saw her fall as their own salvation. The miscarriage was a silent scream in Anne's soul, echoing in the chambers of her heart. The male child, lost at around 15 weeks, had been her hope, her shield against Henry's wandering affections and the sneering nobility who doubted her worth. Its loss severed her last tether to power. Henry's reaction was chillingly swift. Once he had torn apart Christendom for her, now he scarcely visited her chambers, muttering to courtiers of being seduced by witchcraft. He dined with Jane Seymour, who now wore the royal colors of white and gold, her quiet confidence a stark contrast to Anne's fiery presence. Anne was being replaced not just as a wife, but as a symbol. Jane embodied the court's longing for docility, purity, and fertility. Anne had been the flame, but Jane was the hearth, a beacon of traditional womanhood that soothed the fractured court. The court's mood shifted palpably. Once loyal allies avoided Anne's gaze, their bows stiff, their smiles forced. Her ladies-in-waiting, sensing the tide turning, began to curry favor with Jane, who waited in the wings with folded hands and silent ambition. Anne's chambers, once filled with music and laughter, felt like a prison. Her wardrobe, once a dazzling array of French silks and Italian velvets, seemed to mock her fading power. Still, Anne fought. She prayed in her private chapel, her voice trembling as she sought divine guidance, her fingers tracing the pages of her illuminated Book of Hours. She reasoned with Henry, kneeling before him in the great hall, her dark eyes searching as for the love that had once burned so fiercely. At times, he softened, his hand brushing hers, his gaze lingering on the face that had once captivated him. But the warmth never lasted, and realized with dread that he no longer needed reasons to discard her, only an excuse. The miscarriage was branded an omen, and superstition festered in the vacuum of reason. Whispers claimed her womb was cursed, her bloodline tainted by ambition, her past, her French education, her assertiveness, her time in the libertine court of Francis I was recast as sin, evidence of her unworthiness. She wrote eloquent, desperate letters to allies in England and abroad, reminding them of her role in the English Reformation, the birth of Elizabeth, and the intellectual debates she had championed. She had patronized scholars like John Cheek, distributed alms to the poor, and pushed for an English Bible accessible to all. But none of it mattered now. History would not remember her triumphs, only her failure to produce a son. In her private chambers, Anne clung to her daughter Elizabeth, weeping as she whispered lullabies of defiance. Even in infancy, Elizabeth mirrored her mother's fire, bright-eyed, sharp-voiced, unyielding. Her auburn hair, so like Henry's, was a reminder of the blood that bound them, but her spirit was Anne's alone. Anne vowed her daughter would rise, reclaim their name, and refuse to be broken. She kissed Elizabeth's forehead, her tears falling onto the child's soft curls, and whispered promises of a future she knew she would not witness. By spring, the court was a gilded cage. Every word Anne spoke, every move she made, was watched and recorded by Cromwell's informants. Her laughter, once a melody, now sounded hollow in the echoing halls. Outside her chambers, Jane Seymour waited, her ambition cloaked in silence, her pale face a canvas for the court's hopes. Anne, once Queen of England, stood on a blade's edge, the world waiting to see if she would fall or be pushed. The machinery of her destruction moved with ruthless precision, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Once her ally in dismantling the Catholic Church's grip, he now sought her ruin with a vengeance born of ambition and survival. Anne had crossed him too many times, disputing his seizure of monastic wealth, challenging his foreign policy, asserting her own influence over Henry. Cromwell, a man who had clawed his way from a blacksmith's son to the king's right hand, understood power's fragility. He planted suspicions in Henry's ear, framing Anne's sharp tongue as defiance and her lost child as divine judgment. Henry, paranoid and eager to move on, gave Cromwell tacit permission to act. Spies targeted men close to Anne. Mark Smeaton, a talented but lowly musician whose lute playing had once delighted her. Sir Henry Norris, the king's trusted groom of the stool. Sir Francis Weston, charming courtier. And William Brereton, a Cheshire gentleman with ties to the Boleyns. Their interactions with Anne, however innocent, shared jests at banquets, courtly dances in the great hall, were twisted into scandal. Smeaton, under duress in the Tower's dank cells, confessed to an affair with the queen. Whether tortured or coerced by promises of mercy, his words formed the cornerstone of a deadly case. One by one, the others were arrested, their names dragged through the mud. Even Anne's brother, George, was ensnared, accused of incest, a charge so obscene it shocked even the hardened court. The accusations were grotesque: adultery with 5 men, treasonous plots to murder Henry, ambitions to rule alongside her brother as lovers. The scandal was designed to poison public opinion and justify a swift, merciless end. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested while playing cards in Greenwich's Queen's apartments. The summons came abruptly, the guards' faces impassive as they entered the candle-lit room. Bewildered but composed, she stood, adjusted her sleeves with a trembling hand, and followed them to a barge waiting on the Thames. The river, grey and restless, carried her to the Tower of London, its stone walls looming like a judgment. As the barge glided past Traitor's Gate, Anne's dignity remained unbroken, her face a mask of resolve. Her trial on May 15, 1536, was a farce cloaked in legality, staged to seal her fate. In the Tower's great hall, Anne stood in black velvet and ermine, her dark hair coiled beneath a French hood, her eyes fierce and unyielding. She scanned the chamber, daring the assembled peers to believe the lies. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided, his face as cold as the stone walls, his loyalty to the king outweighing any familial bond. The jury, handpicked by Cromwell, owed their fortunes to Henry or feared his wrath. The charges: adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, drew gasps from a carefully curated audience of nobles, diplomats, and chroniclers. Anne defended herself with calm precision, her voice steady as she denied each accusation. She invoked her honor, her faith, and her loyalty to Henry, her words a beacon of reason amid the rising tide of hysteria. She recounted her service to the realm, her patronage of reform, her charity, her love for her daughter. Some in the crowd wavered, moved by her eloquence, but the verdict was inevitable. George, tried separately, matched her defiance, his wit sharp even as he faced the axe. Both were condemned, Anne to die by burning or beheading at Henry's discretion, George to the gallows. In her cell in the Tower's bell tower, Anne received the verdict with a strange serenity. The stone walls, damp and cold, seemed to close in, yet her spirit remained unbroken. She wept, not for herself, but for Elizabeth, fearing her daughter's future stripped of legitimacy, abandoned by her father, surrounded by a court that had murdered her mother. She prayed fervently, her voice echoing off the walls, her fingers clutching a rosary as she sought strength, dignity, and grace in death. Her ladies, some loyal to the end like Margaret Lee, others spies for Cromwell, tended to her with trembling hands. They brushed her hair, adjusted her gown, and listened as she recited psalms, her voice soft but resolute. The only mercy granted was a skilled swordsman from Calais, summoned to ensure a swift beheading, sparing her the agony of the axe or the flames. The trial had been a shadow play, justice in appearance, execution in essence. Anne Boleyn had entered the court a queen. She left it condemned, her fate sealed not by guilt, but by the fragile pride of a king and the ruthless ambition of men who feared a woman with too much power. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned unnaturally quiet, a pale mist clinging to the Tower grounds as if the world mourned. Anne rose early, dressing in a gown of deep gray damask and a crimson kirtle, colors both regal and somber, chosen to reflect her queenship and her acceptance of fate. A simple gold cross hung at her neck, a final assertion of her faith in a world that had turned faithless. She had spent the night in prayer, reciting psalms with her ladies, her voice a steady thread in the darkness. Her final hours were marked not by rage or sorrow, but by reflection. She asked for forgiveness, gave it freely, and accepted her end with the composure that unnerved her guards. At 8 o'clock a.m., she was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, built specifically for her execution to afford her the dignity of a queen, even in disgrace. A small crowd of nobles, officials, and her household gathered, their faces a mix of pity, fear, and curiosity. Silence reigned as Anne climbed the steps, her poise unbroken, her gown rustling softly against the wooden planks. She addressed the crowd, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the morning air. "Good Christian people, I'm here not to accuse anyone but to die." She praised Henry, called him a gracious and noble sovereign, and asked for prayers for his soul and hers. Her words, devoid of bitterness, stunned the onlookers, some of whom shifted uneasily, struck by her grace. She knelt, adjusting her skirt to fall with dignity, and thanked the executioner, a swordsman whose skill promised a clean death. Her ladies, tears streaming, tied a blindfold over her eyes, their hands trembling as they touched her for the last time. The executioner, trained in the art of mercy, called for his sword as a ruse to ease her final moment, drawing it silently from behind his back. With one fluid motion, the blade fell. Anne's head struck the straw, her body collapsing in eerie silence. Her ladies screamed, falling to their knees as her blood pooled, warm and red, against the pale wood. Her body was placed in an old arrow chest, no coffin prepared for the queen who had once been crowned with golden lilies. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, a quiet grave for a woman who had stirred empires. In the aftermath, a strange stillness fell over the court. Anne's name was erased, her portraits destroyed, her motto, "The Most Happy," scraped from palace walls, her jewels redistributed to Jane Seymour, who married Henry 11 days later on May 30, 1536. Elizabeth, declared illegitimate at age 2, was relegated to obscurity, her claim to the throne nullified. She was sent to Hatfield House, a royal nursery far from court, her status reduced to Lady Elizabeth, the king's bastard child. Yet Anne's legacy endured, a spark that refused to be extinguished. Elizabeth, even as a child, carried her mother's fire. Her intelligence, her piercing gaze, her unyielding spirit echoed Anne's. Those who knew her spoke of her precocity, her sharp mind, her ability to charm even the sternest Tudors. Anne's influence lived in the Protestant reforms she had championed, in the English Bible she had promoted, in the subtle shift of women's roles at court. Her enemies had cast her as a villainess, a seductress, a traitor, but time wove a more complex tapestry. Her servants, those who remained loyal, women like Margaret Lee or men like Thomas Wyatt, the poet who mourned her in verse, whispered stories of her kindness, her love of music, her sharp wit. Some claimed her ghost haunted the tower, her dark eyes searching for justice, her footsteps echoing in the chapel where she lay. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558 at age 25, it was a resurrection of Anne's legacy. Crowned in Westminster Abbey, she ruled with her mother's wit and resolve, navigating a treacherous court with calculated restraint. She cloaked herself in the myth of the Virgin Queen, refusing marriage to preserve her power, a lesson learned from her mother's fall. She never spoke Anne's name in public, wary of the scandal that still clung to it, but a locket ring with her mother's portrait, worn until her death in 1603, betrayed her private devotion. In quiet moments, she questioned her tutors, men like William Cecil, who had known Anne about her mother's time at court, her fall, her final days. Elizabeth restored Anne's vision. The Protestant Church flourished. Women like Bess of Hardwick wielded unprecedented influence, and her reign, spanning 44 years, was a testament to the resilience of her mother's bloodline. Enemies called her Anne's daughter in scorn, suggesting her intellect made her dangerous, her independence unnatural, her rule suspect. But Elizabeth bore the mantle with pride, rising above the scandal of her birth. She was her mother's daughter, not in shame, but in triumph. Anne Boleyn became a myth, a martyr, a mystery, a queen who was never meant to rule, who changed the world with her ambition and was destroyed for daring to rise. Her story, retold across centuries, endures as a symbol of ambition and its brutal cost. In literature, Natalie Dormer's fiery portrayal in The Tudors, Philippa Gregory's nuanced novels, and feminist scholarship, she is both schemer and heroine, her complexity a mirror for each generation's struggles with gender and power. Historians debate her guilt, her influence, her intentions, but her ambiguity is her allure. Was she a cunning manipulator or a visionary reformer? A victim of patriarchal forces or a woman complicit in her own downfall? The truth lies in the gray, where Anne's story thrives. Portraits, like the one at Hever Castle with her iconic bee necklace, 3 pearls dangling from a golden letter, stare back with silent defiance. Their authenticity debated, but their power undeniable. The Tower, where she died, draws pilgrims who tread the ground of Tower Green, leaving flowers at the scaffold site, whispering her story with reverence. Guides pause at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, as if listening for her voice on the wind. Anne's legacy transcends her execution. She reshaped England's religious landscape, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation that defined Elizabeth's reign. She challenged the boundaries of women's roles, her influence echoing in the powerful women who followed Catherine Parr, Elizabeth I, even modern figures who draw inspiration from her defiance. Her story serves as both a warning and an inspiration that even in death, a woman's influence can endure. Elizabeth bore her inheritance, not just a crown, but the specter of her mother's fall. Every decision she made was weighed against the shadow of Anne's execution, a reminder of the cost of power. She became a master of statecraft, knowing when to yield, when to strike, when to vanish into myth. The Tudor dynasty built an empire, but at its heart lay a mother and daughter, divided by death, united by defiance. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to erase her, to silence her voice, and obliterate her memory. Instead, it immortalized her. The horror of her end lies not only in its injustice, but in its necessity, brutal lesson in the cost of challenging kings. Yet in her daughter's reign, in the pages of history, and in the hearts of those who remember, Anne Boleyn rose again. She was a queen, a mother, a revolution, and she was never forgotten.